Good afternoon, and welcome to today's segment of Lunch Break with the Rabbi. Today is Wednesday, the 6th of Elul, as we continue on our journey preparing for the high holidays. Just want to remind you, as I do, usually to all the information about the high holidays can be found on jewishali.com, HH5781. Today we're going to talk about the teachings of the oral law versus the written law and how they came about, taking one sampling of a very common law known in Judaism and see how the oral law and the written law are integrated and must be learned one with the other. We all know that there's a law prohibiting mixing or cooking or eating milk and meat together. As we know, the signature symbol of a kosher kitchen is that there are meat dishes and that there are dairy dishes, that there's a meat side, there's a dairy side. The signature dish that a Jew is not allowed to have is a hamburger, or a cheeseburger, whatever you want to call it, and that is because of the cheese and the meat mixed together. What is the reason? Where do we see it in the Torah that eating the prohibition of milk and meat together? Now, 2 weeks ago, in the Torah reading, we read the verse in the book of Deuteronomy that it says, and in fact, it's mentioned 3 times in the Torah, one shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Now, if you look at a kid, what is it? Number 1, it's telling you it's a young goat. Number 2, it can't be cooked together. Number 3, it has to be its mother's milk. How do I know from there that any meat and any milk cannot be mixed together, and it cannot be cooked together, it cannot be eaten together? Maimonides suggests from here and says that the same idea that the Torah that Moshe gave us and told us, Lo savashel gedi b'chalev amo, which is the Hebrew, that one should not cook a kid in its mother's milk, also tells us about the laws about any milk, any meat is prohibited from mixing and being cooked together. Not only you're not allowed to mix it together, you're not allowed to cook it together, you're not allowed to enjoy it together, you're not allowed to eat it together, any of those things. But how do I know it? The Torah only says it clearly, a young goat, its mother's milk. The Torah only uses the terminology cooking. So contrary to popular belief, the oral law wasn't a thing that came about 200 years or 1,000 years after the Torah was given. A bunch of rabbis got together and said, let's see how we can make life difficult for the Jewish people, and therefore started adding a bunch of laws and perimeters and so on of what a person is allowed and not allowed to do. The actual oral law was given to the Jewish people together on Mount Sinai when Moses came down from Mount Sinai. With the second set of tablets, Moshe came down from Mount Sinai the day after Yom Kippur, and he taught the Jewish people the Torah, the written law, and all the explanations that he gave in understanding what the written law is became then the oral law. Because if you were to look in the written law today, in the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, pick any verse you want, it is almost impossible to understand that verse without the explanation and interpretation of the oral law. So the oral law is intertwined, integrated, all one with the written law. So it wasn't something that the rabbis came later on, but it was actually something that Moses passed down from Mount Sinai. When he initially got the written law, he told us exactly what the oral law is. Let's just take some examples. One example, we mentioned about the mitzvah of mezuzah. Which Jewish home doesn't have a mezuzah? You open up a mezuzah, every single mezuzah should have a scroll in it, which it says the Shema, and that prayer of the Shema is written on a certain amount of lines in a certain structure with lines with a certain handwriting, and almost every kosher mezuzah around the world has that. What does the Torah actually say when it says to put up a mezuzah on the door? And you shall write them on your doorposts. The Torah doesn't say what to write. The Torah says you should write it on your doorpost. So maybe you should take some spray paint and all of a sudden graffiti it all over your doorpost. How do I know that it's a little scroll that hangs on a specific place in the doorpost? It is because when Moses gave us the written law, with it he gave us an interpretation, an explanation, and said this is what it means. And this is how it was passed down from generation to generation. Another classic example is a tefillin. Nowhere in the Torah, in the written law, does it say it has to be a black box with scrolls inside and straps, the way we know tefillin looks today. It is only because we learn from the words totafot, which Moses then interpreted to mean what it should be and how we have the tefillin today. And you will find nobody argues about it. So back to what we're saying in our case. When the oral law was given to us and telling us when it means cooking milk and meat together, means any type of milk, any type of meat, not only cooking, but also eating, was the oral law interpretation that Moses gave to the Jewish people at the time when the Torah was given. But many ask, what was the point of that? Why can God just say it clearly? Why does God have to go in so many different ways and write everything shorthand that we should be able to understand it and then have to explore it and then have to need interpretation? And that is because, imagine you're sitting in a lecture. You can't write everything that the lecturer says. You write it in shorthand. And then from there, you then continue and understand and appreciate what the lecturer was saying, and you expound upon it. The same idea is also when God gave us the Torah and gave Moses the Torah, Mount Sinai. The Torah was the base for everything. And within every single verse and within every single letter, within every single word, there is a deeper meaning that can then be continued to explore and extrapolate. Our job as the Jewish people studying the Torah is to own the Torah. How do we own the Torah? It's not by just reading verbatim what it says there, but by reading it, understanding it, comprehending it, and making it real and applicable and contemporary to our life. And the only way we can do that is when we have the basis of the written law and the room for interpretation and extrapolation as passed on with the rabbis from generation to generation. So what God in essence did was by giving us the groundwork is in the written law. And from there, we extrapolate on within the framework that God has set to be able to understand fully and appreciate what the written law says. With it, we also know that there was something called, in Hebrew, they call it Halacha LaMoshe Misinai, a law that was given from Moshe and Mount Sinai, which these are specific interpretations and the scholarly explanations to the specific laws, like we explained before, how the mezuzah looks and how the tefillin looks. And so too in our case, when it comes to the law pertaining the cooking of milk and meat together. So for example, the rabbis have extrapolated, when it uses the word cooking is not only something which is used in the Torah terminology only for cooking in water. Anytime a food becomes ready or ready to eat, and then the Torah calls it cooking. So when the Torah says cooking milk and meat together, it doesn't only mean cooking, it can mean roasting, it can mean anything that it can be formed ready to eat. The same idea when it says kid, young goat, the Torah uses that terminology for sheep, the Torah uses it for goat, and the Torah uses it generally for the term of a beef, so it could be any type of animal. When it uses the mother's milk, we know that the Torah uses the terminology, for example, brother or father or son, in an allegory that doesn't always mean literally the mother or literally the brother. So too over here in the mother's milk can mean any type of milk as well. So from this, the rabbis have extrapolated, as we know, based on Moses' teachings from Mount Sinai, that the prohibition applies to any form of meat. And the same thing, it also applies to any type of milk. We're talking about milk that comes from an animal, not almond milk or anything of that nature. However, the Torah does tell us that the only time it applies to is to meat, which is from an animal. The rabbis have then added that being that people generally confuse the two of beef and chicken, therefore, or fowl, any type of fowl, they've considered fowl meat as well. But practically speaking, any type of meat and milk will make it considered non-kosher, and that is based on the oral tradition that we've given. And all these laws that we have within the context of the verse, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk, enables us to derive all these further extrapolations as it is in the system of the written law versus the oral law. Talking of milk and meat, just one more interesting tidbit is if you notice that there's something called dairy and there's meat. What's something that's in between is called pareve. It's neither meat nor milk. It can be eaten with either meat or milk. Why are eggs from a chicken considered pareve? Eggs can be eaten with your morning breakfast. It can be eaten with your dinner. Eggs is something which can go with milk or meat as well. Shouldn't eggs be meat if it comes from a chicken? And the interesting thing over here is how the rabbis set their perimeters or set the laws that they should be able to, for people to avoid pitfalls. That means when the rabbi set the law that one should be considered foul just as meat regarding milk and meat mixed together, the reason why they did that, because almost universally every fowl is called a meat. And it's almost undistinguishable that we can make between a fowl and a meat when a person refers to meat or fowl, whether it's chicken, meat, duck, whatever it may be. And for this reason, they made one big universal category called meat, and that included fowl and meat and any type of meat, which now would be allowed milk and meat. However, the rabbis did not take their decree even further to say that anything that comes from the chicken should also be considered meat, because that is already distinguishable to knowing what it is and how it is. And that's why kosher eggs, you don't even need a kosher supervision to know if an egg is kosher. If you see that the egg is not a round egg, it's like sort of pointy to the top and then wider on the bottom, you know that it's an egg from a chicken, and then it is automatically kosher. So what the rabbis did over here was that they saw where there might be some type of confusion, created a boundary so that confusion should be limited. However, where the confusion was not a problem, they still allowed it to keep its original status. So chicken became the status of meat because of the confusion, while egg remained parve and can be eaten with milk or meat. Thank you for joining us today. Tomorrow we will continue in our discussion of ethics of our fathers as we do on every Thursday. Looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 1 p.m. lunch break with the rabbi. Have a wonderful day.